The city of Atlanta is still dark when the taxi pulls up to 32 stories of glass and limestone.
A man steps out,
Jacket wrinkled,
jaw unshaven.
one bag bra leather worn at the corners, hanging from his shoulder like something that has survived a long time by refusing to be replaced. He looks us up at the building. 1 second, maybe 2. Not the look of a man arriving somewhere new. The look of a man arriving somewhere that costs everything to us. Inside, the marble is cold. The chandeliers are lit. A woman by front desk looks up, and something behind her eyes makes a decision before he reaches the counter. She has no idea who he is. That is the only reason any of what happens next is possible. He sets his bag down. He says, "I'd like a room, please." And the morning begins to go wrong in ways that will take 45 minutes to fully understand, and 6 months to begin to repair. The taxi smelled like pine air freshener and old vinyl. James Carter didn't notice. He was looking out the window at the Atlanta skyline, doing what Atlanta always did at 6 in the morning, turning pink at the edges, slow and reluctant, like it didn't want to commit to another day yet. He understood the feeling. 8 hours in a conference room in Chicago, 3 hours in economy, because the earlier flight was oversold and he didn't want to wait. 0 hours of sleep, because the seat in front of him reclined all the way back and the man in it snored like a small engine. His jacket was wrecked. The navy one he'd worn to the investor presentation the night before, which had gone well. Everything had gone well. The numbers were clean. The projections were solid. The room had liked him now, sat on his shoulders like something rescued from a lost and found bin. He didn't change. He never changed. Not because he was lazy, not because he didn't own nicer things, because the jacket was the point. The taxi slowed, and there it was, Apex Grand Hotel. 32 stories of glass and limestone rising out of the street like it had always been there, like it had grown up out of the concrete organically, which was almost funny, because James knew exactly how much concrete had gone into the foundation, and exactly how long it had taken to pour it, and exactly how many mornings he had stood on that site in the rain, arguing with the project manager about load-bearing specifications. He knew every inch of that building. Taxi stopped. James paid cash. He always paid cash in situations like this. Not because he didn't have cards, but because cash was final. Cash didn't ask follow-up questions, and he stepped out onto the polished driveway and looked up. A Carter Hospitality property. The letters were smaller than the hotel name. Deliberately, he'd been specific about that in the design brief. He didn't want his name to be the first thing people saw. He wanted the building to be the first thing they saw. The name was just a fact, a legal fact chiseled into granite, placed below the thing that mattered. He picked up his bag, brown leather, worn at both corners. The strap had been repaired once, about 4 years ago, with a piece of replacement leather that didn't quite match the original. His mother had bought it for $19 at a salvage shop off Peachtree Street the week before his college graduation. She'd wrapped it in newspaper because she didn't have gift wrap. She'd written on the newspaper in red pen for the next chapter, "Love, Mom." He'd been offered better bags, many times. He carried this one. The doors opened automatically, sensors he'd approved, calibrated to open at a specific distance, not too soon, not too late. The timing deliberate, and the lobby came at him all at once. Marble floors the color of cream. A chandelier throwing light across fresh orchids on the center table, white against green, replaced every 3 days per standing order. The scent of jasmine from diffusers near the elevator bank. The scent he'd spent 2 weeks selecting from samples, looking for something that said welcome without trying too hard. Soft jazz from speakers hidden in the ceiling. A playlist he'd personally curated with the audio consultant. Nothing too recognizable, nothing that would date the room, just warmth and movement, and the sound of somewhere. Good. Everything exactly as designed. He allowed himself exactly 1 second to feel it. Then he crossed the lobby toward the front desk. The woman behind the counter was handling a checkout. A couple, man in linen, woman in cashmere, both moving with the easy confidence of people who had never once worried about a bill, were receiving their receipts and their smiles and their "thank you for staying with us" The woman at the desk had blonde hair pinned into a smooth twist and a name tag that read Ashley Thomas, and a smile that was doing everything a smile was supposed to do. She was good at her job. That much was obvious immediately. James waited. The couple moved away. The woman's smile stayed for exactly 3 more seconds, a trained hold, the industry standard. You don't drop the expression until the guest is fully gone. Not until the door swings shut behind them, and then it changed. Not dropped. Changed. He noticed the difference. A dropped smile is neutral. What replaced Ashley Thomas's smile, when she turned and saw James Carter standing at her counter, was something else. Something that happened in the eyes first, before the face could catch up. A recalibration. A split-second assessment that moved from his face to his jacket to his shoes to the worn bag at his feet and then just barely back up, not to his face, to somewhere around his collarbone, close enough to seem like eye contact, not actually eye contact. He knew the difference between those two things. Do you have a reservation? Each word clipped. Not rude exactly. Efficient. The kind of efficient that is a form of rudeness. I don't. I was hoping to check availability for a room. She didn't answer immediately. She arranged something behind the counter, a stack of key cards that suddenly required her full attention, and let the silence sit for a beat longer than it needed to. We're fully booked. James glanced past her left shoulder. The reservation screen was angled at about 40 degrees, not fully facing him. But he designed the counter layout, and he knew where the screen sat, and he could read enough of the grid to see what he needed to see. Green blocks, dozens of them. Standard rooms, deluxe options, 2 categories of suite, all green. Your screen is showing quite a few open rooms. Ashley's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. Most people would have missed it. James was not most people. His COO called it his superpower. And his flaw simultaneously. The ability to read a room down to the millimeter meant he never stopped reading rooms, never fully turned it off, even when he was exhausted, even when he just wanted a bed. Her hand moved to the monitor and angled it further away. Those are held for corporate accounts and advance reservations. We don't accommodate walk-in guests. That was a lie. Not a misunderstanding, not a gray area, a lie. James had written the walk-in policy himself. 12 years ago, on a Tuesday night, at his kitchen table, working from a template he'd built from the ground up, because he wanted every property to operate the same way. Because consistency was the thing that kept people coming back. Because his mother had worked in hotels that didn't have consistency. And she'd told him what that felt like from the inside. Walk-in guests get full access to available inventory. No exceptions. No tiered availability based on booking channel. He had written that sentence. I see. What would the rate be for a standard room if one were available? Ashley's exhale was small and theatrical. The performance of patience stretched thin. Our base rate is $450 a night. Before resort fees, that would bring you to approximately $540. She let that number hang in the air, left a small space after it. The kind of space that expects someone to flinch. James didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a card on the counter. Black, matte, no raised numbers, no decorative pattern. Just a small logo in the lower left corner and his name embossed across the center. American Express Centurion. The card that doesn't have a credit limit because the institution that issues it doesn't put limits on accounts at a certain threshold. The card that most banking professionals see once, maybe twice, in an entire career. The card that doesn't get declined at luxury hotels because the system is designed specifically to ensure it doesn't. Ashley looked at the card. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone whose plan has hit a small obstacle and is recalculating. She picked it up between her thumb and index finger, the tips, barely touching it, and swiped it through the terminal. Waited. The machine beeped, declined. Flat. Final. Not apologetic. That's not possible. Please try it again. I tried it. She pushed the card back across the counter using her index finger, one slow push, and did not pick it up again. Perhaps you should contact your bank to verify the account status. She didn't say the word. She didn't need to say it. The word hung in the air between them without being spoken. the way certain things do, implied so completely that saying it out loud would have been redundant. Every person within 8 feet of that counter understood what she meant. James picked up the card. His hand was steady. What Ashley Thomas did not know, what nobody at the front desk that morning knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, a maintenance ticket had been submitted to the facilities management system, flagging the front desk terminal for intermittent connection errors. The terminal was losing sync with the payment processor during low traffic periods, typically between 4 and 8 in the morning. The ticket had been marked received. It had not been marked resolved. It had been sitting in the queue under the property manager's login, unassigned, for 21 days. The card worked fine. The machine didn't. The proof was in the system, in the transaction log, in the maintenance records, in the timestamp on the original ticket, and the conspicuous absence of any follow-up action. James knew about the ticket because the system had flagged it to his operations dashboard, and he had seen it 2 weeks ago and had assumed it was being handled, which was, he was beginning to understand, a mistake. "I'd like to speak with a manager." Ashley Thomas's smile came back. Not the warm one, the other kind, the one that meant something entirely different. Of course. She reached under the counter. Just one moment, she didn't reach for a phone. She reached for a panel beneath the counter ledge, the security notification button, the one that went directly to the floor supervisor and the head of security simultaneously. James saw her hand move. He knew the layout of every service panel in every property he owned. He didn't say anything. Robert Williams appeared from the hallway to the left of the front desk about 40 seconds later. 52 years old. Gray suit, perfectly fitted, not expensive, but maintained with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was authority. Silver tie, tight half Windsor. Hair swept back, every strand placed. He walked with his chin angled slightly upward, the unconscious posture of 2 decades, spent moving through spaces where he was always, definitively, in charge. He looked at Ashley first, then he looked at James, the same scan, the same top to bottom, the same pause at the jacket, the shoes, the bag, and back. What seems to be the issue? Ashley tilted her head toward James in the way someone might gesture toward a piece of furniture that needed moving. She summarized efficiently. No reservation. Walk-in request. Card declined. Guest not cooperating with the suggestion to seek accommodation elsewhere. Robert Williams turned to James with the expression of a man who had already decided the conclusion and was now simply proceeding through the necessary steps to reach it. "Sir, my colleague has explained the situation. We don't have availability for walk-in guests tonight. I've seen the reservation screen. There are open rooms. Those rooms are committed to other purposes." Not a flinch, not a blink. The response of someone who has told a version of this lie many times and has stopped thinking of it as a lie. "I'm going to need to ask you to vacate the lobby. I'd like to understand the basis for that request. I came through a public entrance. I attempted to conduct a standard business transaction. I haven't raised my voice or violated any regulation. What specifically is the justification for?" "We have standards here." Robert Williams said it the way someone reads from a document they've memorized. Not loud, not aggressive, just definitive. The tone of a man who believes that saying something with enough certainty makes it true. "Standards regarding the caliber of our clientele." He let the word sit. Caliber. James looked at him. He was thinking about his mother. Not in the way people think about their mothers in sentimental moments. He was thinking about her specifically and practically, about the way she used to come home from a shift and sit at the kitchen table for 15 minutes before she did anything else. Just sitting, not eating, not reading, not talking, just existing in a chair, without anyone telling her where to be or what to carry. About the way she would sometimes say, after a particularly long day, that the hardest part wasn't the work she could do. The hardest part was walking into a building every morning and being invisible to most of the people in it. Robert Williams was not a monster. That was the thing that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't lived it. He wasn't a monster. He was a product. A man who had spent 22 years in an industry that had never pushed back against the version of standards he'd built inside his head. Nobody had ever made him define the word. Nobody had looked at the pattern of decisions he made and connected them into a shape that had a name. He was what happened when a bad idea went unchallenged long enough to become a policy. "There's a property on 5th Street, Robert continued, "that like to speak with your manager." Robert Williams looked at him for a moment, then with the patience of a man performing patience. "You're speaking with him." First wall. James looked past him toward the lobby. To the sofa beneath the painting, a coastal sunrise, oil on canvas, original work, commissioned from an Atlanta-based artist whose name he had personally approved, the long cream-colored one, near the elevator bank. "Then I'll wait here while I contact my representative." Robert Williams's face did something complicated. He'd expected James to leave. That was the plan, the small, unconscious, never explicitly stated plan that everyone involved had been operating from without putting it in writing. Ask him to leave, he leaves. Situation resolved. He wasn't leaving. "Sir," but James was already moving. He crossed to the sofa. He sat down. He put the bag on the floor beside his feet, crossed one leg over the other, and took out his phone with the unhurried movement of a man settling in for something. Robert Williams stood at the front desk and watched this happen. Then he reached under the counter and picked up the phone. Across the lobby, in the corner near the coffee service station, a woman named Nicole Torres was having what had started as a quiet morning and was becoming something else. 26 years old. She'd checked in the night before for her cousin Marcus's wedding ceremony this afternoon. Brunch this morning, which she was killing time before by drinking a cappuccino she'd let go cold about 12 minutes ago because she'd gotten distracted watching something or someone. Nicole had a journalist's eyes. Not because she was a journalist, she worked in digital content, which was adjacent to journalism the way a food truck was adjacent to a restaurant, she always said, but because her father had been a reporter for 30 years, and she'd grown up in a house where you didn't just watch things happen. You asked why they were happening. You looked for what wasn't being said. She'd noticed James Carter the moment he walked through the door. Not because he was remarkable to look at. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that had clearly had a long night, carrying a bag that looked like it had lived a full life. Average, by every visual metric that a hotel lobby used to sort people into categories. What she noticed was the way he looked up at the building before he walked in. 1 second. Maybe 2. Not the look of someone arriving somewhere new. The look of someone arriving somewhere that had a complicated history with them. A specific kind of recognition that you only produce when a place has asked something of you, and you gave it, and now you're back. She'd filed that away. Then she'd watched the counter. Her thumb had drifted to her camera app 3 times. 3 separate times, she'd started to open it, and then stopped. Because who was she to insert herself into someone else's situation? Because maybe she was reading it wrong. Because maybe this was just a misunderstanding, and it would resolve itself in the next 30 seconds, and she'd look like someone who went looking for fires to film. Except 30 seconds had become 5 minutes. 5 minutes had become 10. The man at the counter had not raised his voice, had not become aggressive, had stood there with his hands loose at his sides, and asked for a room in a hotel and been told no in a dozen different ways, each one slightly less subtle than the last. And now he was sitting on the cream sofa, and the manager was on the phone. Someone, and the expression on the manager's face was the expression of someone doing what comes naturally, completely confident that what comes naturally is the same thing as what is right. Nicole thought about her father. Her father was 64 years old. He was the kind of man who wore khakis to the grocery store because he took his surroundings seriously. He was an engineer, retired, with a laugh that started low and built until it took over his whole face. He was the smartest person she had ever known. He was also the person she had watched get told by a bank teller to wait over there, while the teller helped 3 other customers who had arrived after him, without explanation, without acknowledgement. Just wait over there. He'd waited. He always waited. He'd told her once that the thing nobody understood from the outside was that sometimes you waited, not because you thought it was fair, but because you'd calculated exactly how much fighting back was going to cost you, and decided the transaction wasn't worth the price. She was thinking about that calculation. She was thinking about what it meant that the man on the sofa had also made it, had decided to stay, to wait, to not give them what they were looking for, and wondering whether she was about to make a different choice or the same one. Her phone was already in her hand. She tilted it against the coffee cup, so it looked like nothing. Opened the camera, found the angle. Hit record. The red dot appeared in the corner of the screen. She left it running. Back at the front desk, Ashley Thomas had already pivoted back to her work. A new guest had approached a businessman in a well-tailored blazer. Rolling luggage, the practiced ease of someone who traveled enough that checking into hotels had become as automatic as brushing teeth, and she was processing his check-in with precision and warmth and a smile that reached her eyes. Same counter, same woman, same marble under both their feet. James watched that from the sofa. He watched the way her shoulders changed, the way her voice opened up, the way the transaction moved brisk, warm, efficient, every courtesy extended and received. He wasn't angry. He had passed through anger sometime around the 4th minute of the conversation. What was on the other side of anger, in his experience, was something colder and more useful. Clarity, the particular quality of attention that arrives when you've stopped, hoping the situation will improve on its own, and started thinking about what needs to happen next. He unlocked his phone, scrolled to a name, Catherine Hill, CO, Carter Hospitality Group, 45 years old. She had a law degree she used for exactly 15 months before deciding that what she actually wanted to do was run things, at which point she had pivoted into operations and never looked back. She had been with the company for 11 years. She knew every property, every contract, every clause in every lease, and she had the specific quality of grace under pressure that James had spent 3 years learning to recognize, and another 4 years trying to never take for granted. He dialed. 2 rings. James. Her voice was completely alert. Whatever she had been doing, and it was 6:30 in the morning, she could have been doing anything. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for the phone to ring. Catherine, I need you at Apex East, right now. He kept his voice even. The lobby wasn't quiet enough to carry the conversation far. But he was a man who had learned early that the way you spoke in difficult moments either escalated things or contained them. He chose containment, always. Bring the HR directors, bring Cynthia. A pause. Small. She was already moving. He could tell by the background sounds shifting. What happened? I'll explain when you get here. How 20 minutes? Maybe less. Good. He ended the call, put the phone back in his pocket. And from across the lobby, Robert Williams watched this happen with an expression that had reorganized itself into something new. Less certainty. Not worried exactly, not yet, but aware, in the way of a man who has just seen the situation acquire a variable he hadn't accounted for. He said something to Ashley. James didn't catch the words. Ashley said something back. Then Robert Williams walked toward the far side of the lobby, put the phone to his ear, and began describing the situation to whoever was on the other end. The word aggressive. James heard it from 15 feet away. Aggressive. He was sitting on a sofa with his hands in his lap, speaking to no one, occupying exactly the space a piece of lobby furniture would occupy, and the word being used to describe him was aggressive. He thought, there it is. Not surprised. That was the part that people always found hard to understand. He wasn't surprised. He was something else, something more like grief, maybe, mixed with a kind of tired familiarity, the recognition of a pattern he had encountered enough times to know its shape the way you know, the shape of something you grew up next to, something so constant, it had stopped being remarkable and become simply the texture of the world you moved through. He thought about Dorothy Carter. His mother had worked for 31 years in properties like this one. Properties he had later made his business to understand from the ground up. and she had never not once complained about the work. The work was fine. The work was something she was good at and took seriously. What she had complained about, in the quiet, indirect way that she complained about things, was the invisibility. The way she could move through a room and be so thoroughly unseen that she began to wonder, on the hard days, whether the problem was her. He'd told her once, "It's not you." She'd looked at him in a way he still thought about, not like she didn't believe him. More like she believed him, but wasn't sure that changed anything. He'd been 23. He hadn't known how to say, "I'm going to build something that changes this." He hadn't known yet that he was going to build anything. He just knew the thing she was describing was wrong, and he wanted to push back against it with whatever he had. What he'd had at 23 was ambition, and not much else. Now he had 14 properties and 600 employees, and a set of operational standards he had written himself, line by line, because he believed that if you wanted culture to exist, you had to build it deliberately. You couldn't just hope it emerged. He had built it, and somewhere in this building, it had broken. That was the thing he needed to sit with. Not the personal humiliation that was real but survivable. He'd survived versions of it before, and he would again. The thing he needed to sit with was the system question, the question of how many times this had happened, in this lobby, to people who didn't have Catherine Hill's number in their phone. People who couldn't just sit and wait, because they had somewhere to be. People who had swallowed it and walked out and never said anything, because saying something was its own kind of cost. He looked up at the chandelier. Custom. Italian glasswork. He'd sourced it himself. Spent 3 months going back and forth with the manufacturer on the specification. Because he wanted the light it threw to feel natural warm without being yellow, bright without being harsh. He'd wanted every person who walked through those doors to feel, at the moment they crossed the threshold, that they had arrived somewhere that was prepared for them. That was the whole point. Not the marble, not the orchids, not the playlist. Those were tools in service of the point. The point was the feeling of welcome. He looked back down at Ashley Thomas, who had moved on to the next transaction, at Robert Williams, who was still on his phone near the concierge desk, speaking carefully into the receiver, at the couple Timothy and Sharon Clark, sitting on the sofas near the main entrance. The man was in a linen blazer, early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of self-assurance that came from never having needed to earn it. His wife was in a cashmere sweater, pearl earrings, a designer bag sitting upright in her lap. They had been seated when James arrived. They had both watched the interaction at the front desk. The man had said something to his wife about 10 minutes ago. Just loud enough to be directional, if not quite audible. His wife had not responded. She had looked at the front desk. She had looked at James. And then she had looked at her hands in a way that James recognized, not quite agreement with her husband, not quite disagreement, but a discomfort she hadn't yet decided what to do with. James noted that, filed it away. He looked at his watch, 6:47. Catherine would be here in roughly 17 minutes. He thought about what she would see when she arrived, what she would need. He had already done the mental inventory, the maintenance log, the transaction record, the booking screen, the security footage from the lobby cameras, all of it sitting in systems that Catherine would know how to access, all of it building into a picture that was unambiguous. He wasn't thinking about what happened to Robert Williams or Ashley Thomas. That wasn't his decision to make alone, and it wasn't a decision he was capable of making clearly at 6:47 in the morning after no sleep. He was thinking about the system question, about what this morning meant for the other 13 properties, about who else was working a morning shift right now, with a version of Robert Williams's caliber of clientele philosophy running quietly in the background, unchallenged, because nobody had ever made them articulate it out loud. That was the audit he needed. Not just this lobby, all of them. He heard footsteps and looked up. Brian Thompson was walking toward him, head of security for the night-to-morning shift, based on the pin on his lapel. Broad-shouldered, measured stride, the practiced neutrality of someone trained to appear calm regardless of internal state. He stopped about 2 feet from the sofa. "Sir, I need to let you know that you've been asked to leave the property." "I've been asked." "I've declined, politely. I'm waiting for a business associate who will be here in approximately 15 minutes. I'm not creating any disruption. The property management has requested." "I understand what they've requested. I'm asking you to tell me the specific legal basis for the request." "I'm in a hotel lobby. I'm sitting quietly on publicly accessible furniture. I haven't trespassed, threatened anyone, or violated any statute you can point to." Brian Thompson was quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet than the others. Not the practiced quiet of someone buying time to deliver a predetermined answer. The genuine quiet of someone actually thinking through what they'd been handed. He looked at James, looked back toward the desk, looked at James again. "I'll need to confer with the duty manager." "Of course." Brian Thompson walked back toward the desk. James watched him go. In the corner of his field of vision, he caught something, a small adjustment, barely perceptible. The woman near the coffee station, young, dark hair. She had shifted her phone on the table, angling it slightly, and then gone very deliberately still. His mother used to say that you could always tell when something mattered by the way people went quiet around it. He thought about that. He sat in the lobby of the hotel he'd built, in the chair beneath the painting he'd commissioned, surrounded by the scent he'd selected and the light he'd specified and the music he'd chosen, and he waited. Not passive. Loaded. The way a coil is loaded, compressed, quiet, holding everything inside it for the moment when it becomes necessary to release. 19 years ago, Dorothy Carter had sat on a kitchen floor in a house in southwest Atlanta and told her 11-year-old son that someone had called her worthless, and the manager had told her to finish cleaning the bathroom. He had sat with his back against a hallway wall and listened to her cry. He hadn't known then that he was building towards something. He'd just known, with the specific certainty that children sometimes have about the things that matter, that the world he was sitting in had something wrong at its center, something that could be fixed, had to be fixed, had to be. His phone was in his pocket. Catherine Hill was in her car. The clock on the lobby wall read 6:51, 32 stories of glass and limestone above him. His name in the stone outside. He sat and waited for the next thing. Word count, 3,421 words. This output covers approximately half of part 1, continuing now to reach the 6,807,000 target. The lobby had a particular quality of sound at this hour. Not quiet exactly. Hotels were never fully quiet. There was always the distant percussion of a service cart, the compressed hiss of an elevator arriving at its floor, the soft electronic chime that played before a door release, the machinery of hospitality running in its lowest gear. But the guest population was thin at 6:50 in the morning, and the conversations were muted, and what filled the space instead was the architecture doing its job. The marble carried sound strangely, diffused it, made everything feel slightly underwater, slightly suspended, like the moment just before something shifts. Robert Williams returned from his phone call. He didn't look at James. He looked at Ashley, said something low and efficient, and Ashley nodded once and turned back to her screen with the posture of someone who has received instructions and is executing them. Brian Thompson returned to his position near the entrance and stood with his arms folded in the particular way that said, "I'm here, but I'm also not escalating this unless I have to." The lobby continued. A man in a business suit came through the revolving door, pulling a roller bag, checked in under 3 minutes, took his key card and his bottle of complimentary water, and was gone before the elevator doors opened. Ashley's smile for him was full wattage. Both hands on the counter. "Good morning, welcome back. We have you in the room you requested." The transaction was smooth and warm, and exactly what a transaction in a place like this was supposed to be. Same counter. James watched the man disappear into the elevator car and let himself sit with what he was feeling. Not anger. He'd named that already, passed through it, set it aside. What he was sitting with now was something harder to name. It was the feeling of standing inside your own work and seeing it fail in a specific way. Not the catastrophic failure, the building wasn't on fire, the numbers weren't collapsing, nothing was broken in the structural sense. It was the smaller failure, the failure of character, the gap between what you said you were building and what you actually built when you stripped away the design and the decor and the carefully selected jasmine, as is in, and looked at the human behavior underneath. He was thinking about the word he'd used in the original company charter, dignity. He'd written it in the purpose statement, the second paragraph, the part that followed the boilerplate about hospitality excellence and guest satisfaction. He'd written, "This company exists to create environments where every person who walks through our doors is treated with dignity, full stop, not modified by what they look like, what they're wearing, what they can afford, how they arrived. Every person." He'd been specific because he'd needed to be specific. Because vague values produced vague behavior. Because he knew that the people who violated those values never thought of themselves as violating them, they thought of themselves as exercising judgment, making contextual decisions, reading the room. He'd tried to write a charter that left no room for that interpretation. Somewhere between the charter and this morning, something had gotten through. His phone vibrated. He glanced down. "Catherine, 8 minutes out. Elaine is with me. 2 HR on their way from downtown." He typed back, "Thank you," slipped the phone away. At the entrance, Brian Thompson uncrossed his arms and straightened slightly, not a dramatic shift, just a small reorganization of posture that meant something had changed in his field of attention. James followed his eyeline. A police cruiser had pulled into the curved driveway. 2 officers came through the door. The first was a man named David Jones, based on the badge visible as he approached, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, the unhurried competence of someone who had worked enough hotel lobby calls to know they were rarely what they were reported to be. The second was Stephanie Harris. 38, dark hair cut short, a quality of attention about her that was different from her partner's in a specific way. Where David Jones surveyed the room generally, Stephanie Harris had already located every relevant party and was cross-referencing them against something. They didn't come to James first, they went to Robert Williams. James watched Robert lean toward them slightly, watched his hands make a small, controlled gesture, the gesture of a man being reasonable, contextualizing, providing helpful background. Watched one of Robert's hands indicate James's direction with a careful, professional movement that said not threatening exactly but definitely a problem. Watched Stephanie Harris make a note. Then they came toward the sofa. "Sir." David Jones, even, professional. "Can I see some ID?" James produced his wallet without hurrying, took out his license, handed it over. David Jones looked at it, looked at James, looked at the license again, ran it through his shoulder radio. The radio crackled briefly and came back clean, the way it always came back clean, because James Carter had no outstanding warrants, no priors, not even an unresolved parking citation. "Mr. Carter." The officer's voice had shifted slightly. Still professional, but the edge was gone. Whatever he'd been braced to find, he hadn't found it. "Can you tell me what's going on here? I came in looking for a room. I was told the hotel was fully booked, despite the reservation screen showing multiple available rooms. My credit card was described as declined, though I have reason to believe the terminal is experiencing an error rather than the card itself. I asked to speak with a manager. The manager indicated he would call the police. I said I would wait for my business representative. I've been sitting here since." He said all of this calmly. Not defensively, not performing calmness, actually calm. The way you are when you've spent 38 years developing the ability to remain legible in situations designed to make you illegible. Stephanie Harris had moved to the front desk while he was speaking. She was looking at the reservation screen. "Excuse me." To Ashley, "What do these green blocks represent?" Ashley hesitated. 1 second too long. "Those are they indicate rooms that are in transition between statuses." "What status are they transitioning from?" And 2. Another pause. "Currently available." So there are available rooms. There are corporate holds. How many green blocks are there currently? Ashley looked at her screen. There was nowhere for her eyes to go except the screen, and she knew it. 23. Stephanie Harris wrote that down. She wrote it down without emphasis, without comment, without any visible reaction. She simply noted it in her book the way a person notes a fact because it was a fact, a flat and uncomplicated fact, a fact that the lobby's reservation screen had been displaying since before James Carter walked through the door, and would continue displaying until someone changed it. David Jones handed back the license. Mr. Carter, you're not in any legal jeopardy here. The property has requested you vacate. And as private property, they have standing to make that request. But there's nothing criminal about where you're sitting. I understand. My representative will be here in approximately 7 minutes. I'd like to wait. The officers exchanged a look, brief, almost invisible. The kind of look that people who work together develop as shorthand. This one said, "Let's see where this goes. We'll stay until this is sorted out." Robert Williams's face was doing something complicated. He had called the police to create a specific outcome. James Carter, escort, out, situation closed. The officer's arrival was supposed to be the final step in a process. Instead, they were standing in his lobby, looking at the reservation screen and writing things in notebooks. He moved toward them. "Officers, I appreciate your response. This individual has been asked multiple times to leave the property, and his continued refusal. We understand the situation. Stephanie Harris, not looking up from her notebook, will let you know if we need anything further." Robert Williams stopped. It was a small stop, contained, but it was the stop of a man whose script had just been taken away. He stood near the front desk with his hands at his sides, and the silver tie he'd straightened twice this morning, and the authority he'd entered the room with, and all of it was just suspended, waiting. Without the forward motion it had been counting on, Ashley Thomas was looking at her keyboard. In the corner near the coffee station, Nicole Torres had not moved. Her cappuccino was completely cold now. She hadn't touched it since the police walked in. The phone was still where she'd positioned it, angle unchanged, the small, red dot still blinking in the corner of the screen. She was thinking, how much of this do I have? She was thinking, what happens if I don't post it? She was thinking about the thing her father had told her once, when she'd asked him why he'd become a journalist in the first place. He'd said, "Because somebody has to be the person who tells the truth about what they saw, and if nobody does it, then it didn't happen." "Not really." Then he'd laughed and said, "Also the hours are terrible, so pick something else if you can." She'd laughed too. She was not laughing now. She was watching a man in a worn navy jacket sit on a cream sofa in a hotel lobby and not be broken by something that most people would have already left to escape. She was watching him hold his position with a stillness that was not passive. That was the opposite of passive. That was the specific stillness of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to let it happen all the way rather than cut it short. She didn't know who he was. She knew what she was watching. The doors opened, not the revolving door and not the side entrance, the main doors. Both panels opening together, which they only did when 4 or more people approached the threshold simultaneously, because that was how, of the me. Sensors were calibrated. 4 people entered Apex Grand Hotel at 7:04 in the morning. The first was Catherine Hill, 45 years old, a suit in deep navy, not the same navy as James's jacket, a darker shade, more deliberate, the blue of something chosen rather than worn in. Her hair was pulled back cleanly, not a strand out of place, not because she had taken extra time but because that was simply how she was. The same way she was always the most prepared person in any room she walked into, the same way she had been since the first week she'd joined the company as general counsel and immediately begun rewriting the contracts in a language the operations team could actually use. Behind her, James Okoro and Faye Lindstrom from HR, each carrying a leather portfolio, and behind them, Cynthia Lewis, 50 years old, silver hair cut close, briefcase in one hand and phone at her ear, already talking. Catherine crossed the lobby, Her heels struck the marble with a precision that wasn't loud but was present, each step deliberate. Each step landing exactly where she intended. She went directly to James, stopped in front of him, extended her hand. He took it. "Mr. Carter." Her voice was measured, just below carrying distance for the rest of the lobby, except the lobby had gone quiet in the way lobbies do when something is shifting, when the ambient noise has dropped, because everyone in the room has unconsciously redirected their attention. "I'm sorry for what you've experienced this morning. I got here as fast as I could. I know you did." He stood, and Catherine Hill turned. She turned slowly, the way someone turns when they've decided. The next several minutes are going to require a particular kind of precision. When they've rehearsed in their head in the car the exact order in which things need to be said. She looked at Robert Williams. He was looking at her. "This is Mr. James Carter." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The lobby was so quiet that the ventilation system was now audible. "Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Carter Hospitality Group, the man who designed this building, the man whose signature appears on the company charter, the man who owns this property." She paused. "One beat. The man who signs your paycheck." The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a specific quality of silence. The kind that forms when something irreversible has just been said, when a fact has entered the room that cannot be unheard, cannot be walked back, cannot be softened by any subsequent language. Ashley Thomas's face did something that started in the eyes and moved to the rest of her face too slowly, the way bad news always moves when it's too big to process at normal speed. The color left her cheeks in a single exhale. Her hands, which had been resting on the keyboard, in the alert posture she maintained during every shift, went still. She looked at the spot on the counter, the exact spot, where she had pushed the card back with the tip of her index finger because she hadn't wanted to touch it again. Robert Williams opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and what came out was not a sentence, so much as the sound of a sentence being assembled from pieces that no longer fit together the way they had before. That's not, I didn't." He looked at Ashley. Ashley was looking at the counter. He looked at Brian Thompson. Brian Thompson was looking at the middle distance with an expression that said, "I am not part of this, and I am very carefully remaining not part of this." He looked at the police officers. Stephanie Harris had stopped writing. David Jones had both hands clasped in front of him, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyebrows had made a small, involuntary movement upward and had not entirely returned. James stood. He buttoned the jacket, the wrinkled, travel-worn, deliberately chosen jacket with the same unhurried calm he'd maintained through the entire morning. He picked up the bag, the brown leather bag with the worn corners and the repaired strap and the $19 origin story that he was never going to stop carrying. He walked back to the counter, same spot he'd stood in an hour ago. He looked at Robert Williams. "I built this company because my mother worked in hotels like this one for 31 years. She cleaned rooms and stripped beds and refinished floors, and she was good at every part of it, and she never once called in sick, and not one person who worked above her in 31 years ever looked her in the eye when they spoke to her." He stopped. "Let that sit. I designed this building, this specific building, these floors, this counter, the light in this room, because I believed I could make something different. Something that treated every person who came through that door the same way, not based on what they were carrying, not based on what they looked like." He looked at Ashley. She was looking at the counter. "I came here this morning because I was tired, and I wanted a room, and in 45 minutes I learned more about what I've actually built than any audit or review has ever told me." He looked at Catherine. Catherine was already talking to the HR directors, low and efficient, the portfolios open, papers being removed. He looked at the sofa, the cream-colored one, beneath the painting of the coastal sunrise. He thought about his mother sitting at the kitchen table after a shift, 15 minutes of pure stillness before she could become a person again. He thought about what she would say if she could see this lobby. He thought about what she would say if she could see him standing in it. In the corner of the lobby, Nicole Torres was looking at her phone screen. 7 minutes and 12 seconds of video. Her finger was on the screen. She was still deciding. Except she had already decided. She'd decided the moment she pressed record. She just hadn't caught up to the decision yet. She opened the app, found the clip, didn't add music, didn't add a filter, typed 4 words into the caption field and then deleted them. Typed 6 different words and deleted those too. Finally she wrote, "This happened this morning. I don't know who this man is, but I know what I saw." She hit upload, put the phone face down on the table, and ordered another cappuccino, because the first one was completely cold and she had a wedding to get through later and she was going to need the caffeine. The conference room door was opening. Conference room B had glass walls. That was deliberate. James had specified it in the design brief conference rooms with interior glass panels, not for aesthetics, but for accountability. Closed-door meetings that were still visible. Privacy of sound without privacy of conduct. He'd read enough organizational behavior research to know that transparency in physical design produced different behavior than opacity. People acted differently when they could be seen even if they couldn't be heard. He hadn't anticipated watching that principle work in reverse. Catherine was inside with Robert Williams and Ashley Thomas and the 2 HR directors and Cynthia Lewis, whose phone had vinyl into her briefcase, because this was the kind of meeting where you put the phone away. Through the frosted lower panels clear above shoulder height, frosted below, another deliberate specification, James could see the shapes of them, the posture of the room. Robert Williams was sitting with his shoulders up, the compressed posture of a man trying to hold territory he already knew he'd lost. Ashley Thomas was a smaller shape beside him, very still, the stillness of someone who had stopped trying to calculate outcomes. Catherine was standing. Catherine almost always stood in meetings where the power dynamic needed to be established quickly. James had noticed this about her in year 2 of their working relationship, and had never commented on it because it worked, and commenting on things that work is a way of jinxing them. James was sitting on the same sofa, the same cream-colored sofa under the same painting, except now the lobby felt different. The air had changed the way air changes after a thunderstorm. Same room, same oxygen, but something had been discharged that had been building for hours, and the absence of that pressure made the space feel wider. David Jones and Stephanie Harris were still present. They had relocated to a position near the concierge desk, close enough to observe, far enough to not be hovering, and Stephanie was reviewing her notes with the focused attention of someone assembling a structure she wants to get right before she commits it to anything official. Brian Thompson was near the entrance, not quite at his station, a few feet off from where he'd stood before. The geometry of his position had shifted in a way that was small and unmistakable, not withdrawn. Exactly, but no longer occupying the space of someone executing a directive. More like someone waiting to understand what directive applies now. Timothy Clark was still in the lobby. His wife Sharon had moved. She was no longer sitting beside him. She had crossed to one of the armchairs near the east window, the ones that looked out onto the street, and she was sitting with her hands in her lap, and her eyes on the window and the expression of someone reviewing a decision. Timothy had his phone out. He was looking at the screen. Specifically at something he'd filmed. Specifically at a video he'd been holding in his hand for the last 12 minutes, while the landscape of the morning rearranged itself around him in ways he had not foreseen when he started recording. His thumb moved, hesitated, because deleting a video is easy. It's one button, except when you've already shown it to yourself 3 times, and you're not entirely sure why you kept watching it, and whether that means something, and whether the answer to that question is something you want to sit with right now in this lobby. He deleted it. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at his wife across the lobby. Sharon was not looking at him. Inside conference room B, Robert Williams was talking. James could tell, by the movement of his shape, through the glass hands out, weight shifted forward, the body language of someone who was explaining, rather than confessing, who had come into the room with a version of events that he was. still at this moment, attempting to present as the correct one. Catherine's shape did not move. When Catherine was listening to something she disagreed with, she became very still. Not tense still, the quality of stillness that came from knowing exactly what she was going to say when the other person was finished. And having no anxiety about waiting. James knew this. He'd sat across from that stillness many times. He didn't envy Robert Williams the experience of being on the receiving end of it for the first time. His phone vibrated. He looked down. A notification from the property management system. Not unusual, the system pushed alerts throughout the day on maintenance, occupancy, revenue metrics. He'd set his personal alerts to filter for priority items only. This one was tagged priority, urgent, terminal A, front desk payment processing error confirmed. Transaction log 400-730 shows 17 declined authorizations flagged as terminal error. Not card, issuer error. Maintenance ticket 4,471. Filed 22 days prior, unresolved, cross-referenced. All 17 transactions require retroactive review. Estimated processing impact significant. He read it twice. 17 transactions, not just his. In the hours before he'd arrived, during the window, when the terminal had been malfunctioning, 17 other guests had had payment transactions fail or had been told they'd failed at this counter. 17. He thought about that number. He thought about the distribution. Who came through a hotel lobby between 4 and 7:30 in the morning. Business travelers. Red-eye arrivals. People who'd driven overnight. People who needed a room immediately and didn't have a backup plan and were relying on the transaction going through. Some of them would have had the card legitimately declined. That happened. But some of them, he looked at the screen, some of them would have been Ashley Thomas telling someone that their card didn't work, when what was actually happening was that the machine didn't work, and those people would have walked away. They would have taken their bags, and their exhaustion, and their confusion about why. Their credit card wasn't functioning, and they would have gone somewhere else, or gone back to the airport, or called someone at 6 in the morning who they didn't want to call. And never known. James put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the ceiling, at the chandelier, at the light it threw across the marble, the same light he'd specified, the warmth he'd calibrated. 17 people. He thought about what percentage of those 17 were people like him, people who had come in looking like they came in and been told no before the card ever hit the machine. He couldn't know that from a transaction log. The log showed failures. It didn't show the conversations that had preceded them. It didn't show the expressions on the faces behind the counter. It didn't show what had been communicated without being said. He was going to need to know. That was the audit. That was the real one, not the numbers, the behavior underneath the numbers. The conference room door opened. Not fully. Catherine stepped partway out and looked toward James with the expression she used when she needed 30 seconds of his attention without making it a meeting. He crossed to her. The terminal log confirms the processing error, Catherine said, low and direct. 17 transactions this morning affected. Williams had the maintenance ticket in his queue for 22 days. He approved a deferral. He approved it 3 weeks ago. There's an email trail. He responded to the facilities team with non-critical, defer to next quarter. James was quiet. For a moment. What does he say about it now? That he wasn't aware the malfunction extended to card authorization errors. He says he understood it was a display glitch. The ticket description explicitly mentions payment processing failures, intermittent connection errors affecting transaction completion. His response was sent 14 minutes after receiving the ticket. Either he read it and made the decision, or he didn't read it and made the decision. Neither is good. James looked through the glass. Robert Williams was sitting now. The forward-leaning posture of the explainer had collapsed. He was sitting with his hands flat on the conference table. And a particular quality of stillness that was the opposite of Catherine's, not the stillness of readiness, but the stillness of someone whose options have narrowed to a single point. Ashley Thomas, she's cooperating. Catherine's voice didn't shift, but something in it calibrated. She says she was following the lead of her manager, that Williams had communicated expectations about guest screening. She uses the phrase, maintaining the brand standard of our clientele. Maintaining the brand standard. Her words. That phrase came from somewhere. It came from Robert Williams. We found it in 2 prior employee feedback sessions. He used it in coaching conversations with front desk staff. The HR records show it appeared in an evaluation he wrote for a different front desk employee 18 months ago. The context was a commendation. He praised the employee for maintaining the brand standard of our clientele during a difficult interaction. James absorbed this. That employee is still here? No, left 8 months ago. Voluntarily. He thought about that, about the chain of transmission, the way a bad idea moved through an organization, not through official policy, but through the language of commendation, through the feedback that told people what was good, through the implicit reward of being told you'd done something right. Robert Williams had never written a discriminatory policy. He'd never needed to. He'd written praise in a way that pointed toward discrimination, and let the staff learn what pointed to on their own. That was, in some ways, more sophisticated than a policy, and more damaging. Because a policy could be challenged, a policy was visible. What Robert Williams had built was invisible. It lived in the culture, in the unspoken understanding of what the standards actually meant, in the comfortable assumption that no one would ever have to define it, because everyone already knew. "Give me 5 more minutes," Catherine said. "Then we're ready." She went back in. James returned to the lobby. He did not return to the sofa. He stood near the center of the room, under the chandelier, and he waited. He thought this was probably the right place to stand. Not aggressive, not retreating. Central. Stephanie Harris looked up from her notes and found him there, and made a small adjustment to her posture that wasn't quite a nod, but functioned like one. David Jones was speaking quietly into his shoulder radio. Near the entrance, a new arrival, a woman in her early 40s, pulling roller luggage, wearing the coordinated efficiency of someone who had done this particular commute before, came through the door and approached the front desk. There was no one at the front desk. The counter was empty. Ashley Thomas still in the conference room, no one assigned to cover. The woman waited, looked around. No one came. She turned and found the nearest hotel employee, a young bellhop, 19 years old, 2 months into his first job, who had been near the elevator bank all morning, and had watched everything bank all morning, and had watched everything that had happened, and was currently experiencing a private reckoning that James could see on his face even from across the lobby. The woman asked the bellhop something. The bellhop moved to the desk, found a tablet, attempted to locate availability. He fumbled with it, then stopped fumbling, found what he needed, processed a room, handed over a key. He did it slowly and with some uncertainty, but he did it. James watched this. The bellhop looked up and found James looking at him. The kid went slightly rigid, the instinct of a person caught doing something they're not sure is sanctioned. James gave him a single nod. The bellhop exhaled, went back to the tablet. The conference room door opened fully this time. Robert Williams came out first. He walked with his eyes at about the level of the floor, not as a performance, but because he was a man who had spent 2 decades using his posture as a declaration, and he no longer had a declaration to make, and without it, the posture had nowhere to go. His jacket was buttoned. The silver tie was straight. He looked impeccable by every external measure, and completely emptied of whatever had filled the exterior. He passed James without looking at him. James didn't stop him. Ashley Thomas came out behind him. She had been crying. Not recently. Her face had dried and she'd made some effort to reset herself. But the evidence was still there, in the redness at the corners of her eyes, and the particular blankness of someone who has spent the last 20 minutes holding something at bay, and succeeded and is exhausted by the effort. She also did not look at James. She looked at the front desk, at the counter she had stood behind for 3 years, at the specific spot where her morning had changed, and then she looked away and followed Robert Williams toward the service corridor. Brian Thompson moved to join them, Catherine behind him, speaking briefly and directly into his ear. He stopped. turned. His face went through something complicated and settled an acceptance that had some relief in it, the relief of a man being told that his situation, while serious, had variables in his favor. He nodded. He walked toward the elevator instead of the corridor. Cynthia Lewis stood near the conference room with her phone back in her hand, already on a call, already building the next structure. The two HR directors were gathering their materials. Catherine came to stand beside James. She didn't say anything for a moment. They both looked at the lobby, at the guests moving through it, at the bellhop still working the desk with careful, deliberate movements, at the chandeliers, at the orchids, at the light. The termination paperwork is complete, Catherine said. Williams and Thomas, effective immediately. The grounds are documented. And Brian Thompson? Suspended with pay pending investigation. His situation is more nuanced. He was acting under Williams's directive. He didn't initiate any of it. He never made physical contact after the initial approach. A pause. He also didn't intervene. Which is its own thing. Which is its own thing, Catherine agreed. She said it the way you repeat something when you want to acknowledge that the sentence contains more than it appears to. James looked at the spot near the elevator bank where Brian Thompson had been standing all morning. Not quite at his post, not quite absent from it. The position of a man maintaining technical compliance while his conscience ran a parallel argument he hadn't yet resolved. He thought about the word bystander. He thought about how it was usually used as an accusation. And how that framing missed something important, that most bystanders weren't cowards. They were people in a system that hadn't built them a clear door to walk through. The capacity to intervene existed. The permission had never been established. That was also his failure. Not equal to Robert Williams's failure, but related to it. From across the lobby, Sharon Ramirez stood up from the armchair by the east window. James noticed her movement. He watched her cross the lobby, and he watched her husband, Timothy, watch her cross the lobby with the expression of someone who doesn't know what comes next in their own marriage, which was a new expression for Timothy Clark to be wearing. Sharon stopped about 4 feet from James. She was a composed woman. The composure was practiced, the composure of someone who had learned early that the alternative to composure was exposure, and who had built their public self around managing that equation, carefully. But the composure had something underneath it, this morning that hadn't been there when she'd first come down to the lobby, something that needed to get out of her. Her voice was low, steady. I sat in that chair, and I heard what they said to you. I heard all of it, and I didn't say anything. James looked at her. That's what I want to say, that I didn't say anything, and I know that's not. She stopped, set. I'm sorry, that's all. I'm sorry. There was a long moment, not uncomfortable. The other kind of long moment, the kind that's giving itself the space it's earned. Thank you, James said. That genuinely. Sharon nodded once, turned and crossed back toward her husband. Timothy was watching her return with the careful face of a man who has spent the last 30 minutes recalibrating and is not sure where he's landed. Whatever conversation was coming between them was going to happen somewhere that wasn't this lobby. And James did not expect to be told how it ended, and was okay with that. David Jones approached Mr. Carter. Given what's come out this morning, the documentation, the camera footage, the terminal records we're going to need to take statements, not today, but in the next day or so. Formal process. I'll make myself available. We'll also be looking at the police report Mr. Williams filed. The characterization of your behavior in the report doesn't match anything captured on the security footage. James looked at him. What happens then? That's above my pay grade to answer. But the report exists and the footage exists, and those two things are going to have a conversation. David Jones had the expression of a man who had been careful his entire career about not saying more than he could back up, and who was right now saying exactly what he could back up, and nothing else. I wanted you to know we saw what we saw. He went back to his partner. Stephanie Harris had closed her notebook. She looked at James across the lobby for a moment, a direct, level look that had no performance in it, and then, She and her partner walked toward the exit together. James watched them go. The doors closed behind them. The lobby had returned to something like its regular state. Guests moving. The coffee service being refreshed. Someone new at the concierge desk, the manager from the second shift, who had been reached by Catherine's team and had come in early, now quietly orienting herself to a desk that looked exactly like it always looked, and was entirely not what it had been 45 minutes ago. Catherine was at James's elbow. I need to discuss the other 12 properties. I know. Not today. But soon, I know. He looked at her. What did the mystery shopper data show for the last quarter? A pause. East was flagged as moderate concern. Williams had managed the process in a way that minimized the range of guest profiles being tested. He managed the process. He submitted a list of suggested test scenarios to the outside firm. The firm used them. James absorbed this. He controlled the audit that was supposed to catch him. Not explicitly. The firm took his suggestions as cooperative input. Standard practice is to accept suggestions from property management as context. They didn't know they were being given an errowed field, which means the quarterly reports for this property have been systematically understating the problem. For at least the last cycle. Possibly longer. The auditor had been audited. The system designed to catch this had been quietly, methodically bent to avoid catching it, by the same hands that needed catching. Not dramatically, not criminally, or at least not in a way that was immediately criminal, just carefully. The way quiet bad systems always operated, not through dramatic sabotage but through incremental redirection, small adjustments to the guardrails that add up to the guardrails pointing the wrong direction. James thought about the word trust. He thought about what he had trusted to run without him, looking at it closely enough. He thought about the maintenance ticket, submitted 22 days ago. Still in the queue, $1,548 to fix a payment terminal that was, this morning, being used as a tool to tell someone their card didn't work when it worked fine. $1,548. He was going to sit with that number for a long time. I want the data for all 14 properties, he said. Not the quarterly reports, the raw interaction data, guest complaint logs, staff conduct records, exit, interview notes, anything that touches guest-facing behavior. 3 years back. That's a significant scope, I'm aware. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Take the time you need. Do it right. Catherine made a note. The way she made notes small, precise, without looking down at the paper, the pen moving from memory, had always struck him as one of the most quietly competent things he'd ever watched a person do. One more thing. Her voice shifted by about half a register, not softer, more careful. The video. I know about the video. You know it exists. You may not know that as of 7 minutes ago it had 420,000 views. James was quiet. Nicole Torres, Catherine continued. She's in room 1208. She checked in yesterday for a family event. The caption doesn't identify you. It doesn't identify the property. It's just the footage. How much did she get? All of it. From when you walked in. The terminal interaction. The police call. The officers arriving. The moment we came through the door. The moment I said your name. A pause. The moment you stood up and said what you said about your mother. He hadn't known she was recording then. He didn't know how he felt about that, exactly. It wasn't violation, the lobby was a semi-public space, and she had every right. It wasn't gratitude. Not quite yet, because gratitude required knowing where the thing was going, and he didn't know that yet. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of finding out that a moment you were inside of had also been witnessed from the outside, and wondering whether the outside version and the inside version were the same shape. 420,000, he said, as of 7 minutes ago. These things tend to move fast once they pass a certain threshold. He looked at the lobby, at the normal morning continuing around them, at the bellhop, still at the desk, still working with careful, deliberate movements, at the spot on the sofa where he'd sat for 45 minutes, at the spot on the counter where the card had been pushed back. I want to talk to her, James said. She's in her room, I know. I want to talk to her. Today. But not He paused. Not yet. There's something I need to do first. Catherine waited. James looked at the conference room. Empty now. The chairs slightly displaced from their positions around the table, the way chairs get when a room has held an argument. I want to write down what I said in there. What I said to them. He meant the lobby. He meant the words he'd said standing at the counter with the bag in his hand. Before I talk to anyone else, I want to get it down while it's still. He stopped. While it's still yours, Catherine said. He looked at her. Yes. She nodded. Conference room A is available. I'll have someone bring coffee. I don't need coffee. I know. I'll have someone bring it anyway. She moved toward the operational tasks. There were many, and they were already beginning to stack, and James stood in the lobby for one more moment. He looked at the orchids on the center table. White against green. Fresh, because he'd ordered them replaced every 3 days. Not because orchids specifically meant anything, but because fresh flowers were a form of intention. A daily choice to maintain the thing you were trying to build. He thought about his mother at the kitchen table. He thought about her hands. He thought about the version of this morning she never got to see. Then he walked toward conference room A, and he sat down, and he opened the notes application on his phone, and he started to write. Not the press statement, not the legal brief, not the operational directive, just what had happened. What it had felt like, what he understood now that he hadn't understood. Before he'd sat in that chair for 45 minutes in the lobby of his own hotel and let a system he had built take a run at him. He wrote for 20 minutes. Outside, in the lobby, at 7:31 in the morning, the Apex Grand Hotel continued its day. The coffee was refreshed. The orchids held their color. The jazz moved through its cycle. The new front desk manager oriented herself to the software with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant she'd handled transitions before and knew that transitions were mostly about keeping the ordinary things ordinary until the extraordinary thing was absorbed. The bellhop at the desk processed 2 more check-ins. He was slower than Ashley Thomas and less polished. And he made one mistake with the room assignment that he caught himself and corrected without assistance. Nobody complained. Several people said thank you. He looked up at one point, no particular reason. Just a moment when his attention lifted from the screen and he looked at the sofa under the coastal sunrise painting and the empty chair where a man in a worn jacket had sat for 45 minutes and not been broken by it, and he thought something that he didn't have language for yet, but would carry with him for the rest of his career in this industry. Something about what it meant to stay. In room 1208, Nicole Torres sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand and watched the number climb. 420,000 had been 7 minutes ago. It was 560,000 now, and rising. She thought about uploading it, and she thought about regret, and she thought about the difference between those two things, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the specific look on the man's face when he'd stood at the counter and delivered the most precise and devastating quiet speech she had ever heard in a hotel lobby or anywhere else. She thought, I don't know who this man is, she thought, but the number knows something. Her phone buzzed. A comment notification. She looked at it. Someone had written, I need to know who this is. She looked at the video. She looked at the lobby behind the man in the navy jacket. At the letters above the entrance, just barely visible in the wide shot. Apex Grand Hotel, she thought. Someone's going to figure it out, she thought. It's going to be soon, she thought. I have a wedding to get to in 6 hours, and my cousin doesn't know his wedding day is going to be the day. His reception keeps getting interrupted by people showing their phones to other people saying, Did you see this? She put her phone face down on the bed, looked at the ceiling. Outside her window, Atlanta was fully awake now. The pink had burned off the edges of the sky, and it was just day clear, bright, ordinary day, the kind that doesn't look like it's going to change anything, the kind that does anyway. The notes he wrote in conference room A were not elegant. That was the first thing James noticed when he read them back, 20 minutes after writing them. They were raw, fragmented in places. Some sentences ended before they resolved, not as a stylistic choice, but because the thought had moved faster than the words and he hadn't stopped to chase it down. He read them anyway. He read them 3 times. Then he opened a separate document and wrote 2 sentences at the top. The first, what happened this morning happens every day, in properties like this. 1. To people who don't own the building. The second, the difference between their experience and mine is not that I deserved better treatment. It's that I had somewhere to put the consequences of the bad treatment. He sat with those 2 sentences for a while. Then he closed the phone and went back to the lobby. Catherine was at the concierge desk with James Okoro, reviewing something on a tablet. She looked up when he came through the door and made a small signal 5 minutes. And he nodded and sat in one of the low armchairs near the window. Not the sofa, different chair, different sightline. He could see the front desk from here, but not the spot on the counter, where the card had been pushed back. He thought this was probably the right distance for the next part of morning. The lobby had been continuing without drama, which was what it was supposed to do. The machinery of hospitality was built to continue. Regardless, it was one of the industry's deepest structural features, the way a ship kept moving even after the crew changed, because the ship was the ship, and it had its own momentum and its own systems, and those systems didn't stop for personnel. Decisions. He thought about momentum. He thought about what it meant that Robert Williams had been in this property for 4 years, and in those 4 years had woven his particular understanding of guest service so thoroughly into the fabric of the place that 2 HR directors and a corporate attorney in the commendations and the coaching sessions and the unresolved maintenance queue, but none of the quarterly reports had caught it. Because the quarterly reports were measuring the right things the wrong way. That was a systems problem, not a character problem. And systems problems were, in some ways, the harder kind to fix, because you could fire a person. You couldn't fire a culture. You had to rebuild it, from the same material, with the same people standing in the same rooms, asking them to see what they'd been taught not to see. Catherine came over and sat across from him. I need to brief you on where things stand, she said. And then I need you to tell me how you want to handle what's coming. Go. Robert Williams has left the building. He did not make any statements to staff before leaving. His personal belongings are being packaged for delivery to his home address. She was reading from her tablet, not because she needed to, but because in situations with this many variables, she found it cleaner to work from the documented record rather than her memory, which was also excellent but not the point. Ashley Thomas also left without incident. She asked me, just before she walked out, whether there was any pathway to appeal. Is there? There is a formal grievance process in the employment contract. She has 30 days to file. Given the camera footage and the transaction records, any appeal is going to be an exercise in documentation. Catherine's voice was flat on this, not unkind, just accurate. Cynthia's assessment is that there's no realistic pathway for her. Brian Thompson, suspended with pay. He'll have a meeting with the HR team within 48 hours. The investigation will look specifically at whether he was given any alternative to following Williams's direction. What we know right now is that he was present, he had agency, and he didn't exercise it in your favor. What we don't yet know is the full picture of what Williams had created in terms of power dynamics on the floor. James nodded. The terminal, he said. Maintenance team is already on site. Replacement unit is being sourced from our partner vendor. They've estimated 3 hours for installation and calibration. Catherine set the tablet down for a moment. The 17 affected transactions from this morning are being reviewed individually. We're reaching out to those guests through the reservation contact information on file. All 17. We'll also be reviewing the previous 60 days of transaction data from that terminal to determine whether the error pattern goes back further than the maintenance ticket. It does. She looked at him. It goes back further, he said. The pattern in the data will show it went back further. The terminal didn't develop an error on the same day the ticket was filed. The ticket was filed because the error had existed long enough to be noticed and documented. Work backward from the ticket date, and you'll find the start of it. Catherine made a note. She didn't ask how he knew. He knew because he didn't understand how systems failed, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, the way everything failed, the way bad things were always in the process of becoming before anyone named them. Media, she said. Here it was, the video. As of 12 minutes ago, approximately 1.2 million views across platforms. The original is on Instagram, but it's been cross-posted to Twitter, Facebook, and 2 of the major media aggregator accounts. No one has yet identified you by name in the public conversation. The comments are mostly, she paused. People are angry. At the hotel, at the staff, at what they're watching. But there's also a significant thread of speculation about who you are. How long until someone figures it out? My estimate is hours, possibly less. The sign above the entrance is visible in the wide shot. Once someone identifies the property, the executive team is public record. And then it becomes a different story. Catherine agreed. He thought about that. He thought about the 2 possible versions of the story once his name was attached to it. Version 1, powerful man gets mistreated, uses his power to fire the people who did it. Story ends there. Version 2, something larger. Something that asked the question underneath the obvious question. He knew which version he wanted. He also knew that version 2 required him to be deliberate about what came next, required him to not simply let the story go where gravity pulled it, which was toward his specific case, his specific identity, his specific vindication, required him to redirect the narrative before it set, before the concrete hardened around the wrong shape. I want to make a statement, James said. Not today. Give it a few days. Let the story develop without me in it for a while. That's a calculated choice. I know what it is. Once your identity is confirmed, press will want a response. They'll want it immediately. Going quiet for a few days is going to read as deliberate. Which it is. He looked at her. If I respond in the first 24 hours, the story becomes about the resolution, the hiring and firing, the corporate response, the optics of a CEO getting swift justice. I want the story to be about the question of what happens to the people who went through the same door I went through and didn't have a number to call. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Not the look of someone evaluating whether to push back, the look of someone recognizing an argument they find genuinely persuasive. 3 days, she said. 3 days. I'll manage the communications team. They'll be getting calls by this afternoon. Have them confirm the property. Confirm the terminations. Do not confirm or deny anything about me specifically until I'm ready. He paused and pulled the audit data. I want to be looking at real numbers before I say anything publicly. She was already standing. One more thing. He said it to her back. She stopped. The bellhop at the desk this morning, the young one. Catherine turned. What about him? Find out who he is. I want to know his name. She nodded, turned back toward the operational center she had established in the 2nd floor business suite, where 3 members of the crisis communications team were already working, where Cynthia Lewis was on her 4th call, where the Carter hospitality group was doing what organizations did when something went very wrong and very public in the same morning, reorganizing around the wound, working to understand its dimensions before deciding how to close it. James sat by the window. He looked at Atlanta. He thought about calling someone. He went through the list of people in his life who would want to know about this morning before they saw it on the news, which was a shorter list than people might expect, because James Carter had spent a significant portion of his adult life building a company and a smaller portion building the kind of relationships where people expected to hear from you before they heard from the internet. He thought about his mother. Not for the first time this morning. Not for the last. Dorothy Carter had been gone for 5 years. He had held the way grief worked, how it stopped being a wave after the first year and became more like weather, something you lived inside of, something that changed the quality of certain days without warning. Today was one of those days, not because he was sad exactly, because he was standing inside something she should have been standing inside with him. And the absence of her was a specific shape, an outline that didn't fill in. He had put her name in the foundation stone. He had never told anyone except the architect. He thought about whether she would have wanted him to tell people, and he thought probably not. She had been a private woman. Not in the withholding sense, but in the sense of someone who kept her most important things close, who understood that naming something out loud sometimes diminished it, who had given him most of what he needed to know about integrity, not through speeches, but through 31 years of showing up. He sat with her for a few minutes. Then he got up and went to find Nicole Torres. Room 1208 was on the east side of the building, which meant a view of the city, rather than the airport, which meant Nicole Torres had been watching Atlanta wake up through her window, the same way James had been watching it from the lobby. He thought about that, two people in the same building, looking at the same city, each doing something they hadn't planned to do that morning and couldn't fully account for. Yet, he knocked. She opened the door after about 10 seconds. She was still in the jumpsuit, green, wrinkled now from sitting, her hair pulled into a rough knot that hadn't been there this morning. She looked like someone who had been awake for several hours, trying to think clearly, and had arrived at the point where thinking clearly required a decision about whether to stop trying. She looked at him. Mr. Carter, not a question, not quite a greeting, the voice of someone who had already absorbed the information and was now managing what to do with it. Miss Torres, he kept his voice level. I'm not here to ask you to take anything down, I know. She stepped back from the door. An invitation, or close enough to one. If you were, you wouldn't have come yourself. He came in. The room was neat in the way hotel rooms stayed neat when the guest was too preoccupied to make a mess. Her bag was on the luggage rack, half unpacked. A dress hung on the back of the bathroom door, the wedding dress, he assumed. Something in navy silk that moved slightly in the air conditioning. On the desk, her laptop, open to a browser, multiple tabs visible from the angle he was standing at, several of them news sites. She saw him see the laptop. She didn't close it. 4.7 million, she said. As of about 8 minutes ago. Catherine told me it was at 1.2. That was 40 minutes ago. It's moving. She sat on the edge of the bed. He took the desk chair, turning it to face her. I didn't know who you were when I posted it. I know. I need you to know that, because I think it matters. I didn't post it because it was going to be big. I posted because she stopped. Recalibrated, because my father is 64 years old, and he's the smartest person I know. And he's spent his whole life walking into rooms that made him feel like a question mark. And I watched you stand at that counter, and I thought, someone needs to see this besides me. James was quiet for a moment. Tell me about your father. She looked at him. Didn't expect that question. He's a structural engineer, retired. He spent 30 years designing bridges and overpasses. Things that hold weight, things that don't fall down. She paused. He used to take me to see his projects when I was growing up. We'd drive out to wherever the bridge was and park, and he'd tell me exactly what was under the road, all the things you couldn't see from the surface, all the work that went into making sure it held. He was so proud of it, not in a big way, just steady proud. Like he'd done something that mattered. He had. She looked at the window. He also spent 30 years walking into meetings about those bridges and having people question his credentials before he got to say a word, having junior colleagues talk over him, having clients direct questions about his own reports to the white engineer standing next to him. She said it, without heat, which was its own kind of heat. He never made a bridge that fell down. He never missed a deadline. And he still walks into rooms and has to spend the first 10 minutes proving he belongs in them. James thought about what it meant to live your whole professional life in the proving zone. The constant expenditure of energy on legitimacy before you even got to the work, the way it accumulated over decades, not into bitterness for most people, but into a specific kind of tired that looked like calm from the outside. That's what you were thinking about, he said. When you decided to record, when I decided to keep recording, She corrected the tense carefully. I'd stopped 3 times before I actually stayed with it. Each time, I thought, this is going to resolve. This is going to be fine. I'm reading too much into this. And each time it didn't resolve. She looked at him directly. You sat down on that sofa and something happened in me. I thought, if he's willing to stay, the least I can do is witness it properly. James sat with that. The least I can do is witness it properly. He thought about witnesses. About what they asked of you, not action, not intervention. Just the willingness to be present with your eyes open and your camera running, and your capacity to look away left unused. I want to ask you something, James said, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing changes about your room or your stay, or the fact that I think what you did this morning was exactly right. She waited. What do you want to do next? She blinked. With the video? With any of it? The video, the attention, the platform you have right now. What do you want to do with it? A long pause. I've been thinking about that since I posted it, she said, and I keep coming back to this. I don't want it to be about me. I want it to stay about what I watched. About the thing you said at the counter. About the people who go through that door every day and don't have. She stopped. Looked at him. You said it. The people who don't have a number to call. If you had a platform for that, James said, a real one. Not just this video, but a way to keep making the same kind of argument. What would that look like for you? She looked at him for a long moment. Are you offering me a job? I'm asking what you'd want if I were. She was quiet. Not the quiet of someone with no answer. The quiet of someone checking whether the answer they have is the true one, or just the first one. I'd want to tell real stories, she said. Not corporate content. Not press releases that sound like apologies, but aren't. Actual stories. From people who work in hotels and airports and hospitals and schools and spend their careers being invisible. The people in the rooms no one films. She looked at her laptop. People like my father. James nodded. He looked at the navy dress on the bathroom door. You have a wedding this afternoon. I do. A small exhale. My cousin Marcus. He is going to lose his mind when he finds out what happened to me this morning. She paused. I mean to you. What I witnessed. Go to the wedding, James said. We can talk about everything else on the other side of the weekend. Whatever you decide, the conversation doesn't have to happen today. He stood. She stood. Thank you, James said, for not looking away. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was still calibrating, still absorbing the morning, still sorting out what it had been and what it was going to become. Thank you for staying, she said. When they wanted you to go, he went back down to the lobby. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, the video crossed 11 million views. His name was confirmed first by a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who recognized the property and cross-referenced the executive records, then by wire services that picked up the local piece, then by every major television network in a cascade that took approximately 4 hours from the first identification to the story being everywhere. The Carter Hospitality Communications team confirmed the terminations and the property name. They did not confirm or deny anything about James specifically. They issued a single statement. Carter Hospitality Group takes all allegations of guest discrimination with the utmost seriousness. We are conducting a full review of this incident and all related practices across our properties. Further details will be provided when the review is complete. 14 words that said everything and nothing, precisely as intended. The story became what James had hoped it would become, which was larger than him. The comments on Nicole's video, now reposted by news organizations, clipped and edited and contextualized by dozens of creators, were not primarily about James Carter. They were about the people responding. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands, people describing their own versions of the morning he'd had. Hotel lobbies, airport counters, bank branches, doctors' offices, car dealerships, restaurants. The same dynamic in 100 different locations. The same architecture of dismissal. The same moment of standing at a counter and being looked through rather than at. The story accumulated weight, not because of what had been done to James Carter, but because of what James Carter's story named for everyone else. On the fourth day, James stood behind a podium. A Carter hospitality property not Apex East, the Atlanta headquarters, a mid-century building in Midtown that housed the executive offices and a boutique hotel of 60 rooms that James had kept, deliberately small as a reminder of where the company had started. The room held 40 journalists, 12 cameras. The lights were bright in the practiced, indifferent way of press conference lighting, which had nothing in common with the light James had specified for any of his lobbies. He had written what he wanted to say. He had revised it twice. He had read it to Catherine, who had suggested 4 changes, all of which he'd accepted, and then added 2 things she hadn't suggested, which she'd also accepted. He came to the podium in a white shirt, no tie, and the same worn jacket. He had debated the jacket, not because he was unsure of the symbolism, but because he was wary of the symbolism being too legible, too performed, too much like a choice made for the cameras rather than a continuation of the habit it actually was. He'd worn it because it was the right jacket for this kind of day, and he had always worn it for this kind of day, and changing it would have been the dishonest thing. He looked at the room. "I'm going to say something first that I want on the record," he said, "and it's this. What happened to me is not the story. What happened to me is an illustration of the story. The story is that the thing I experienced last Thursday morning is a routine experience for a significant number of people in this country. Every day, in every kind of institution you can name. The reason it's news is that I own the building it happened in. And the reason that matters is that it shows you how deep the habit runs, deep enough to operate without checking who's in the room. Deep enough that the people who practiced it never thought to ask whether the man at the counter might have a stake in the floor he was standing on." He looked down at his notes. "Back up. My mother worked in hotels for 31 years. She made the beds that guests slept in, and she cleaned the bathrooms they used, and she showed up on time, every shift, for 3 decades. Nobody who passed her in the hallway knew her name. That wasn't accidental. That was a feature of the environment she worked, in the way it was designed, implicitly, to make some people visible and other people functional. I built this company because I wanted to build something designed differently. And last Thursday I sat in the lobby of one of my properties and understood that wanting to build something different and actually building it are not the same task." He paused. "I failed. Not at the level of 2 employees making bad choices, though that happened. And it has consequences. I failed at the systems level, at the auditing level, at the level of oversight and accountability that should have made last Thursday impossible, before it became necessary to correct it after. That failure is mine and I own it completely." He then announced 4 changes. The first, mandatory training on equitable service, not the half-day compliance module that existed in the current onboarding materials, but a substantive program developed with external experts in organizational behavior, renewed every 6 months, with practical assessment rather than papered certification. The second, mystery shopper evaluations conducted by an independent firm with no input from property management on guest profiles or test scenarios. Quarterly, unannounced, with reporting going directly to the executive team rather than the regional directors. The third, an anonymous reporting channel for employees, designed and managed by an outside organization, so that the fear of reporting up a chain of command that might be part of the problem was removed from the calculation. The fourth, a scholarship fund, $1.5 million to support students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in hospitality management. Not named after him, named after Dorothy Carter. He said her name once clearly, and then moved on. He didn't cry. He had said her name enough times in private that he could say it in public without losing his voice, and he was grateful for that. At the end of the statement, a reporter asked, "Mr. Carter, what do you want the 2 employees to understand about what they did?" He thought about it for a moment. "I don't think I'm the right person to tell them what to understand," he said. "What I hope they understand, what I hope anyone watching this understands, is that the harm they caused wasn't limited to me. I had a way out. I had a number to call. I had Catherine Hill and a legal team and 20 years of building toward a position from which I could absorb this and respond to it. The harm that concerns me is the harm to every person who came through that door before me. And after me without those resources. They are the ones who deserved better and had no mechanism for demanding it. My job is to build that mechanism. That's what last Thursday told me. Not that I was wronged, I was, but that's small. What last Thursday told me is that the building I thought I'd built isn't finished yet. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the next question came, and the next, and the press conference moved through its cycle, and James answered what he could answer, and deferred what he needed to defer. And when it was over, he walked off the platform and found Catherine standing at the back of the room with 2 cups of coffee. He took one. "How did it land?" he asked. "Honestly." She looked at her phone. Comments on the live feed are running about 12 to 1 positive. The scholarship announcement is getting significant pickup. The personal accountability section is being clipped separately. It's going to be the thing that people quote. Good. The Dorothy Carter Foundation is going to get calls starting today. You should decide how you want to handle the administration. I'll talk to Cynthia also. To Catherine lowered her phone. The bellhop. He looked at her. His name is Kevin Perez, 20 years old. He's been with us for 8 weeks. She paused. He's studying hotel management at Georgia State. James absorbed that for a moment. The same school. The same program he'd taken 38 years ago. 2 jobs and a partial scholarship, and the particular kind of ambition that comes from watching your mother work and deciding the only response to that is to build something that deserves what she gave it. Make sure he knows there's a path here, James said, not as a favor, because he's earned it on Thursday morning. He found a way through a situation he hadn't been prepared for, and he handled it. I'll set up a conversation. And Catherine. He stopped her before she turned. The people at the Nashville and Philadelphia properties. The pattern the audit is going to find there. I want to know their names. Not to fire them necessarily, that depends on what the investigation shows. But I want to know who they are. I want to have conversations, not just corrections. She looked at him with an expression that had something of the morning's accumulated weight in it. All the hours since 6:51, all the documentation, and the decisions, and the things that couldn't be undone, and the things that could. You're thinking about the difference between accountability and punishment, she said. I'm thinking about what it means to rebuild something, he said. Punishment is easy. You fire people and the numbers look clean and the press conference goes well and the quarterly report improves and the underlying problem waits. Rebuilding is different. Rebuilding means you stay in the room with the uncomfortable thing and you ask it what it needs. She nodded. She went back to her phone. The Atlanta office continued around him. Phones ringing, tablets open, the organized chaos of a company managing a significant public moment and simultaneously trying to run 14 hotels across the country because the hotels didn't stop running because the CEO had a bad morning. 6 months passed, not quickly, not in the way that movie time passes, compressed and clean, in the way that actual time passes unevenly, with some weeks that felt like months, and some months that felt like nothing had happened at all, with setbacks in the Nashville investigation and progress in the Philadelphia one, with the scholarship fund receiving its first applications, and Catherine spending 2 weekends reviewing them, with a rigor that James had not asked for, but recognized as her way of honoring what the fund was for, with Ashley Thomas filing her appeal, which went where Cynthia had predicted it would go, with Robert Williams not filing anything, because Robert Williams had concluded, after 4 days of consultation with his own attorney, that the documentation made any legal pathway unsustainable, and because he was, at his core, a man who had never been challenged, and therefore had developed no muscle for fighting from a position of demonstrated error, with Brian Thompson completing his investigation, completing his training requirement, and returning to a different property in a different capacity, not because his case was identical to Robert Williams's, but because it was different, and the difference mattered, and treating it the same would have been its own kind of failure. with Nicole Torres making a decision. She had called James 4 days after the wedding, which had been, she reported, extensively disrupted by the video, not in a way that the groom minded, because her cousin Marcus turned out to be someone who thought the whole thing was one of the better stories to come out of the weekend, and she had said, "I've been thinking about what you asked me, about what I'd want." And James had said, "What did you decide?" And she had said, "I want to tell the real stories. The ones from inside the rooms, not the ones that go viral, the ones that don't." He had said, "I think we can build something around that." They had. It was not a job with a clear title. It was a project with a structure that was still being figured out. Nicole, working with the communications team on a series of long-form stories from inside Carter Hospitality Properties, featuring the people who made the properties run, the people whose names nobody learned unless they went looking. Housekeeping staff, night shift bellhops, the women who ran the breakfast service and knew which guests took their coffee before the menu arrived. Her father had been the first person she'd called. She'd told him what it was, what she was trying to build, and he had been quiet for a moment. And then he had laughed, the kind that started low and built, until it took over his whole face, and said, "Your grandfather is going to hear about this, and he's going to be so embarrassing about it at Thanksgiving." And she had laughed too, and then she had cried a little, in the private way, the way you cried when something finally moved in the right direction after a long time of it not moving. And he had let her, the way fathers do when they know that crying is good crying, and the right response is just to be there while it happens. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, James Carter walked into the Apex Grand Hotel. Same jacket, same bag, different morning. The woman at the front desk looked up the moment he came through the door. Her name tag read Amanda Perez. She was 29, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of calm that came from actually liking what she was doing, rather than performing competence over indifference. She smiled. The real kind, the kind that arrived before the guest reached the counter. "Good morning. Welcome to Apex Grand. How can I help you?" Walk in." "Absolutely." Her hands moved to the keyboard. She turned the monitor slightly, not away from him, toward him, just enough to share the view. "We have a few options available. What would work best for you? Floor preference: view, high floor, city side if you have it." "We do. 14th floor, east-facing king. You'd be able to see the airport on a clear day." "That's perfect." She processed the card without drama, without theater, without any of the loaded pauses, and performed assessments that had filled the same transactions 6 months earlier. She processed it because it was a card, and she was a desk clerk, and those were the two things required for this interaction to function. She handed him the key. She handed him a small bottle of water. She said, "Is there anything else I can help with before you head up?" James looked at her. He thought about every version of this moment he had stood in, every counter, every city, every iteration of the same request, from a man in a worn jacket with a repaired bag, every time it had gone the way it was supposed to go, and every time it hadn't, and that those two categories did not distribute randomly across the guests who walked through the door. He thought about Kevin Perez, who was right now in a second semester course at Georgia State and who was going to be very good at this. He thought about Nicole, who was 3 floors above him in the building's east wing, conducting her second interview for the series, sitting across from a woman named Patricia, who had worked in hotel housekeeping for 19 years and had never once been asked to tell her own story to anyone who intended to do something useful with it. He thought about Dorothy Carter, about her name in the stone, about everything she had held without complaint for 31 years, and everything she had given without knowing what it would become. "No," James said. "That's everything." He crossed to the elevator. He rode it to the 14th floor. He went to the window. Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did in the spring, layering green over concrete, asserting its particular version of persistence, the city that burned down and came back and burned again and came back again and kept coming back, stubborn and complicated and full of its own contradictions, and still somehow, still here. The airport was visible at the horizon. A plane on approach, descending in a long gradual arc toward the runway. He watched it come down. He thought about the morning he'd arrived on a plane like that one, 8 hours out of Chicago, wearing a jacket he'd slept in, carrying a bag that cost $19, asking for a room in his own hotel, and being told no in 12 different ways by people who believed they were protecting something worth protecting. He thought about what it had cost him to stay in that chair. Not much, compared to what it cost people who stayed in chairs that didn't have his name on the building above them. He thought that the window, the city, the room that had finally been offered without theater, was not a victory exactly. It was a correction, a small specific correction applied to a large, diffuse problem, and the correction was real and mattered, and was also, in the context of everything else, a beginning rather than an end. His phone was in his pocket. He left it there. For the next few minutes, he was just a man standing at a window, watching a plane find the ground, in a city that was still figuring out what it owed people, and still making the same mistakes, and still, some mornings, getting something right. That would have to be enough. And it was.